Hello and welcome to Robinson Hall Experts Talk. My name's Laura Saunders, Marketing and PR Manager at Robinson Hall, and today I'm joined with David Sawford, Partner and Head of Planning and Building and Project Consultancy. David has been with Robinson Hall for over 28 years and has extensive knowledge of construction methods and building use types, both in design and project management of building works. And today we are going to talk about how you can successfully refurbish a listed property. So David, where should a listed property owner start when it comes to carrying out any work to their property?
Well, as a starting point, it's very important to work out what's listed, what's the important part of the building. Is it a specific feature? So I think really I would say look at the listed register and work out what's important about the building, understand what you want to achieve, and prepare a concise brief.
And in regards to a brief, is that a brief that should come from the property owner, possibly before they actually reach out to an expert, or is that something that we would generally help them with?
It's a mixed bag, both really. The property owner needs to communicate what they're trying to achieve. That might be improving energy efficiency, it might be modernising the building, it might be extending the building or altering the building to make it fit for modern living conditions. You know, a lot of these listed buildings have been around for a long time. They've been altered and adapted many times over the years, but quite often they're not really fit for modern habitation. By that I mean kitchen quite often could be in a quite a small corner of the property, isolated from the living accommodation, and modern trends are to have that incorporated into the dwelling, and the likes of mechanical and electrical integration. You know, a lot of these older listed buildings might have a single plug socket if you're lucky in a room. You know, everything is now electrically driven. You want multiple sockets in each room, and it might seem very trivial putting additional cabling into a property, but the property is listed, and alterations and adaptations, however trivial, require listed building consent.
And what would the process be in regards to moving forward with that? Would you need to kind of come up with some designs in order to look at the electrics and then possibly the different layouts? How does the project move forward?
Yes, generally once we've established the full brief, there'll be a requirement to have detailed plans of the property and to prepare a proposed scheme to show how it's going to be refurbished, or potentially it might be an extension. Extensions to listed buildings are very problematic. We have done them, and quite often the conservation department prefer an adaptation to be clearly visible as an adaptation. So potentially choice of materials might be different to the original property, which goes a little bit against the grain. You'd think that you'd want to try and match in, but sometimes actually showing that it's a different phase works really well. So once the brief is established, prepare existing plans, prepare a proposed scheme, and at that point we can then review the impact on the listed building. As part of a listed building application, there's a requirement for a heritage assessment, and that heritage assessment goes in as part of the application, and that has to look at the whole. It starts broad. What is the impact on the surroundings, and it narrows down to drill down into specific details. And as I said previously, it's important to understand what's important about the building and to explain the significance of the building, and to understand if the alteration is going to have an effect on that significance. If it is, then that's going to be problematic for getting listed building consent, and that's why understanding the important parts of the structure are really critical to having success through the process.
And I would guess that when you actually put the application in, you'd almost need to kind of focus and dwell on those points to make sure that planning is likely to be more successful.
Yes, absolutely. It really does need to drill down into the important features of the building and explain where the adaptations are going to have an impact, whether that is a positive impact, because it can be sometimes a positive impact. Quite often listed buildings have been altered inappropriately over the years, whether that is with consent or without consent. In fairness, quite a lot of listed buildings will have been altered before they went onto the listed register. So quite often you come across interesting things where maybe inappropriate materials such as cement render has been used, which is very problematic on a lot of listed buildings. We see quite a lot of instances, and I can think of one example where it was a 16th century timber frame listed building. The tenant was leaving and the landlord needed to have the property refurbished, and we went to inspect. It was a listed building, so we knew that we were going to need listed building consent for the refurbishment works. The property had 3 significant issues, and one was related to cement render. And it was a timber frame building with wattle and daub infill between the timber, and somebody in their wisdom historically had put metal lathing over the timber frame and then put a cement render. Well, that cement render was cracked when there was the slightest bit of movement, which a lime render would have been softer and allowed it to self-heal. Once it cracked, moisture was getting in behind the render, and the cement render was trapping moisture in the building, causing the rot of the timber frame. So we had a timber frame that was failing. It had a mixture of wattle and daub and brick infill, and some of that was unstable because of the defective timber frame. And it was a case of stripping back the cement render, replacing the timber frame, putting in timber laths and a lime render solution, which is breathable and softer than cement render. So it allows just that slight bit of flexing, because a timber frame will flex over time. It's inevitable with different cycles of heating and cooling of the building, and you need to use a natural product that can move and breathe with the property.
I guess that's another example of why it would be quite good to make alterations to a listed property, even if they are minor, because our experts can come out and do a survey of the property and have a look at how it was created and constructed initially, and whether any changes need to be made to make sure that things like damp or anything like that isn't an issue.
Yeah, damp can often be an issue in listed buildings. I've got an instance actually on site at the moment where we carried out a home buyers, or it was actually a structural survey, when a property was up for sale. Our clients purchased the property, and the survey highlighted a number of issues that they really just flagged up with them, issues that ought to be attended to so that they didn't have a problem in the future. One of them being a suspended floor with a lack of air bricks, so it wasn't getting sufficient air flow under the floor to control the build-up of damp. I therefore went to see the client, and we looked at options and came up with a solution of constructing some ventilation wells with air bricks to allow ventilation into the underfloor void. We prepared the plans, we prepared the heritage statement, submitted the listed building application, which went swimmingly through the planning system, and got listed building consent. That work is now on site, and when we came to construct the ventilation wells, they excavated to reduce the levels, and they came across old ventilation grills that were buried under the earth. Clearly, when the property was originally built, they knew that they needed ventilation, and that's a very good example of how things are altered over the years, with potentially misunderstanding of why original features are there.
Yeah, that's a good example. So you touched on planning, and obviously the fact that planning is required, and there's certain steps that are different to just applying for a normal planning application. How long does a listed building planning application take? Is it a similar amount of time to, say, just a standard planning application, or do they take a little bit longer?
Yes, the statutory, once the application goes in, the statutory time for the determination is the same as a full planning application. But going back to basics, on most properties, the residential property we're talking about, would have permitted development rights. That allows some things to be amended on a traditional building that's not listed. For example, if you wanted to replace a window, you would just go ahead and do it because it was permitted development. On a listed building, that's not the case. You can't just proceed and replace, for example, a window. You have to get listed building consent for that. And as I say, the timeline is the same as a planning application, but there's quite a lot of work that has to go into preparing the application first. I'd also just say on that point, talking about windows, that not everything needs listed building consent. If you had, for example, some rot and you wanted to paint windows and repair them, you can carry out genuine repairs without listed building consent. So by that I mean, if the window casement's rotten, you could cut some of the timber out, infill it with another piece of timber that's like for like, fill it, paint it, and you don't need listed building consent for that. If, however, you were going to replace the casement, that's when you need the listed building consent.
So do you need any consent if you were going to make just minor alterations in reference to that example about the window? Could the property owner just do that without having to kind of get in touch with anyone? Or
genuine repairs that are like for like don't need listed building consent. We're talking about minor things. So, for example, if you had the example of the window that's rotten, if you needed to splice a piece of timber in to repair it prior to decoration, and it was genuine like for like, you're not trying to replace it, then that doesn't need listed building consent. The same with, for example, a roof repair. If you've had some slates slide off the roof, it's a no-brainer. It doesn't need listed building consent to do a genuine like for like repair. But if you were going to replace all of the slates on the whole roof, so you're deliberately stripping a section of the roof in order to replace it, then that would need listed building consent. Ultimately, you would get listed building consent to replace slates, for example, on a roof, as long as you're putting something that's appropriate back. Quite often on listed buildings, the other thing to watch out for is bats. Quite often they very much like crawling into roof spaces. So sometimes that can be a problem when you come to do the works, but also you have to consider this as part of the application. We've had instances where you have to specifically design the scheme, even though what you're removing isn't designed with habitat in mind. Once you know that there is a habitat there, you now need to design in the scheme to such extent that, perversely, we can't use breathable roof membranes because the fibres of the roof membranes can trap bats in them and then they become stuck. So we have to go to the older traditional bitumen felt type membranes if you were going to put a membrane under a replacement roof finish. Ultimately, with listed buildings, if you're looking to carry out a repair which you believe does not require listed building consent, the advice from Historic England is to apply for a certificate of lawfulness, thus confirming that it's lawful. That can only occur prior to the works having been carried out. And just as a highlight, I'm sure most listeners will be aware, it is illegal to carry out works to listed buildings. It is a criminal offence, so it is very important to check with a professional if works you're proposing do require listed building consent and to get the consent. Otherwise you risk potential prosecution. By a formal report, what we would generally do is come and talk to the homeowner or the property owner, understand their requirements, and then put a brief, understand their brief, and if they haven't sort of formalise that, we'd put that into writing to formalise the brief and their requirements. At that point, we can then highlight the issues that we see. whether the works they're proposing are likely to be appropriate, and guide them to something that is appropriate, that we believe that the local authority would support. Quite often, it is a very grey area. One conservation officer may support a scheme and another may not, and it's a judgment call. And our advice really is to engage with the local authority at the earliest opportunity. Sometimes, if schemes are fairly significant, we will at early stage recommend and provide a fee quote for providing a pre-application inquiry to the local authority. So that is basically a step before formally submitting a listed building or planning application, to understand how the Conservation Department will react and what critical issues there may be.
Would you recommend someone doing that when it's a very specialist or unique property, or generally is regardless of what the work involves?
It really depends on the work involved. If the refurbishment or alterations are significant, then we would recommend carrying out a pre-application inquiry. The problem with doing that is that the timeline is the same as a planning application. So if the client's in a rush, it's very difficult to do a pre-application or to justify a pre-application inquiry if the works are not significant, because the timeline just works better going straight for the listed building consent.
I guess the benefit of having pre-application would mean that you would know quite well prior to putting the actual listed building planning application in whether it would get accepted or not.
Yes, absolutely. That's the whole point of the pre-application inquiry, is to provide them the details and to understand all the key issues and how they're going to react. Quite often, it can be quite a positive situation where they may say that they don't like a particular point, but provide a means of tweaking it, which will then mean it is acceptable.
You've touched on materials, and obviously with listed properties, you have to be careful with what materials you use. Is there any other points worth kind of highlighting when it comes to listed building works for the property owner before they kind of get carried away with a brief? Are there anything else that you wanted to just touch on?
There are lots of points, and every property is different, and what makes the property special or important will differ from property to property. So it's very difficult to give a broad brush approach. As I've said already, the key thing is understanding the listed building and what's important. And if you're dealing with period features, quite often, even if that period feature doesn't perform well in the modern context, it will be important to the setting of the listed building. And that might be, let's go back to our example of windows, single glazed windows. It's almost impossible to get a replacement double glazed unit in place of a single glazed casement window. There are instances where we have managed to do that with extensions, for example, but for period properties or period features, the chances are that double glazing might be a no-no, but quite often there's an alternative solution, which might be to secondary glaze the window. So quite often on listed buildings, the Conservation Department will look at potential harm to the structure, and they may take the view quite often that secondary glazing is acceptable because it can be reversed, so it's not harmful to the structure as it in itself. It can be reversed, and once removed, the harm is gone, and therefore that is much more acceptable than replacing the period feature.
I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of listed properties that come onto the market, and I think that they've all got their own quirks. And if you are a buyer looking to potentially buy a listed property, but possibly they're a little bit put off by the worries of they want to make lots of changes to it, and they're worried that possibly those changes might not get approved. What advice would you give to someone that kind of falls in love with a listed property but is put off by possibly the amount of work involved?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and ultimately they need to be very realistic about what can be achieved. I would suggest getting advice at an early stage, in the same way as a prospective purchaser will get a property survey, which for a listed building is likely to be a full building survey. I would actually approach the surveyor and ask them to provide commentary on the chances of success of the alterations that you have in mind. That does require you to sort of be open and transparent and communicate your thoughts about how the property might be adapted or work for you. But that's the critical thing.
Okay, thank you. And we've talked about the process. Do you often find that with the planning application you have to submit kind of detailed design plans as well, and layout plans, floor plans, things like that? Or
absolutely, always. There's validation requirements for planning applications, and that requires a site plan, floor plan as existing, elevations, site plan as proposed, floor plans are proposed, and elevations as proposed. Now, that's the validation requirements. However, if you were replacing a window, or let's say putting a new window, or asking for consent to put a new window in, they would require elevations to fully understand the significance of what is being proposed. They're not going to require elevations of the whole house. It will be only the elevation that is affected by the works. But they are likely to require floor plans of the whole property to understand which room and the context of that. That's really so that they can understand whether the window is maybe in an early phase or a later phase, and also so that they have a record of what's being granted consent for the future, and also for the archives. They keep all of these documents for the archives, so that in 100 years' time, when somebody looks at the property and is proposing to put a door where the window is, and they want to understand, is this an original feature or is it an adaptation? Those records then aid that understanding in the future years.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. In regards to the planning, and we've gone through the process, and say the application doesn't get approved, what's next?
It's important to understand why it's not been approved. There may be a compromise position where you can reconsider the scheme and resubmit it, or potentially appeal it. The chances are that it might be best and quickest to reconsider the scheme and look to try and take on board the comments from the consultees. But as I say, the last resort is to appeal the decision.
And do you find that appeals often get turned into approvals?
On appeals across the board, there's approximately 30% success rate. That's not just on listed buildings, but that's across the board on every appeal. So, as I say, it's generally better to look at the reasons for the refusal and see if you can work with it and adapt the scheme and resubmit, than appeal it. But that appeal option is the last resort. But you've got probably about a 30% chance of success.
So, David, you've touched on some examples, but do you have any other examples of listed properties you've worked on?
Yes, well, we work on a number of types of properties. We've worked on listed hotels and public houses. We've worked on barns, getting planning and listed building consent for barns to be converted to dwellings, which actually is quite an interesting topic, given that the barn is listed as a barn-like structure. It sort of goes against some of the policies I've just been talking about in terms of the character being changed, because clearly when you change a barn to a dwelling, it is going to change the character of the interior space. But quite often it's the lesser of the two evils. Structures need to have a use in order to be maintained and to stay for the future. And quite often some of these listed barns are not fit for modern agricultural purposes. And we have done quite a number of barn conversions, both listed as well as non-listed. And it enables the barn to be converted in a sympathetic way and keep the structure for the future in a keep the traditional materials. They are very complex to deal with, and the choice of materials and the limitations on how they're converted are quite strenuous, but it can be done, and we've done quite a few and they work really well.
Would you have to apply for change of use and get that approved before you then go down the changing it, the designs of the dwelling, etc.?
For the barn conversion,
yeah,
you would need change of use, which is so effectively for that it's almost two applications. You've got the change of use and planning application, which is about the principle of having the dwelling on the site, and then you have the listed building application part, which is about the appearance, the material, and the character, and whether that's going to change it. With barn conversions, they, as I say, that they are very complex, and each barn will be treated on its own merits. Mm-hmm. But in general, they will not allow new openings, or if they do allow openings, they're going to be very minimal and very barn-like. So quite often, maybe slit windows are incorporated into stone walls, or slits between studs of timber frame, so that they're very minimal and they give a concept of looking like a barn. They won't allow new roof lights, no chimneys, no stovepipes, but that's part of owning a listed barn and actually having a barn conversion that looks like a barn.
Yeah, and I guess it makes it a bit more interesting and unique if you have to kind of abide by some of the rules.
They're certainly unique, and some the rules, they are really there to preserve the character of the barn. It is feasible to adapt and alter barns, but they really want them to look traditional. Albeit that I've got another example where we were able to get listed building consent for removal of a lean-to against the barn. So this is a traditional stone-built 16th century barn with a cottage, stone-built cottage next to it. In the 50s, a lean-to extension was built onto the cottage, which was not really very appropriate. Brick didn't match. It had a ground floor bathroom, and the client wanted to try and extend the property and make it fit for modern living and have more ground floor accommodation for elder parents that they wanted to live in the property. We were able to secure planning consent to remove the lean-to, which enhanced the setting of the listed barn, and in return we were able to design a timber frame appearance, almost like a cart hovel type structure, to house a living room and an additional bedroom with a glazed link, providing separation between the stone-built original structure and the new timber frame, which the conservation department liked because, again, they could read they can read the property, they can see what's original, they can see what's adapted, and that glazed link provides the sort of separation between the two phases of the property.
Sounds lovely. So, David, can you see there being any changes in the planning world? As we know, it's ever evolving, changes are made all the time to make it slightly easier, some good, some bad. Can you see any changes happening in the listed building planning world?
I think the short answer is no. I don't foresee it becoming easier to adapt, extend or alter listed buildings. I'm seeing probably the opposite, where local authorities are requiring more information, and it's becoming more strenuous to particularly extend or alter listed buildings. There's an onus on the local authority to preserve these buildings. That's the whole point of them being listed. I also did recently hear of funding being made available to some local authorities to go looking and decide whether additional properties should be listed. So I think there'll be more properties gradually added to the listed building register, and I fear that it isn't going to become any easier to adapt or alter them.
With that in mind, if say you got approached as a property owner and they were suggesting that possibly it'd be your property that would be added to the listed register, is there anything that the property owner could do to try and avoid that?
No, not really.
Right, so the control's completely out of their hands.
No, there is a process where I believe you can appeal, but I think that would be a really difficult process and likely to be unsuccessful, because the local authority will make an argument for listing a property on the grounds of its special character, and and that can be very judgmental. But once they've identified that it's special in some way, either because of its construction or materials or social impact, or special character because somebody special has lived there, then it's going to be very difficult to argue against that.
Thank you, David. I think we've covered everything from how you can make changes to your successfully to your refurbished listed property. It's clear to see that it's not an easy route to go down, and expert advice is sought at the very start of the process. Robinson Hall are here to help you. We've got a broad range of services and obviously are experts in making changes to listed properties. We've touched on various examples. If you are considering either buying or you own a listed property and you want to make changes, please contact us. David Sawford's contact details are dotted around the website. If you go onto the Meet the Team page, you will find his direct line, mobile and email. Please reach out to him. Thank you ever so much, David. Thank you for listening and tuning in. I'll be launching a series of podcasts over the coming weeks and months. Make sure you follow us. They'll be accessible on our website and all the podcast channels. We're always here to help you. Many thanks. Bye.